Gauthier joining you for quite a hangout tonight with our friend David Burkus, author of The Myths of Creativity. So this is a Rockstars speaker series on a bunch of very important subjects for leaders out there as we're setting to reinvent the leadership landscape one leader and one community at a time. So I want to extend a gratitude to our friend David and Elena Iacono, our lead on our speaker series and our TV shows. How are you doing, David and Elena?
I'm well. How's everyone? And David, thank you so much for being here. And Johan, thanks so much for leading this evening.
And I am fantastic. As we were talking about beforehand, I am pulled in from a weekend vacation to hang out with the HR Rockstars, which I'm quite excited about. So my wife gets mad at me because even on vacation, I'd rather be talking about the concepts in the book. I'd rather be working. So that's me. So I'm excited to be here.
And we're excited to have you, David. So we're going to have a 30-minute, very stimulating discussion tonight, and we have a set of questions that Elena and myself prepared. So Elena and I were going to take turns on questions. So something we didn't say before the hangout, but we are. So I'm going to start with the first one. And as I typically say during our spontaneous encounters, there's a lot of room to experiment between point A and point B. So we're going to start and launch a discussion, which I hope is going to be very stimulating. So for people out there listening, enjoy the show, and off we go. So the first question, so before I ask the question, let me just put this up. The Myths of Creativity by David Burkus. So actually, before we went on a hangout, I did go through my notes because whenever I read a book, I like to write in the book. So there's just one sentence I want to read out loud, which inspired me as a person here. Page 10 of your book, David. Creativity is less the outcome of a divine blessing or visitation and more the result of designing the right ecosystem and filling it with properly trained people with diverse perspectives. So what I love about this quote is, well, just the combination of divinity and ecosystem, as we are in the HR Rockstars tribe, a living ecosystem. So in your book, you speak about divergent thinking, the power of incubation and being open to experiences, which we are. Before we went into the discussion, I was saying you're such, embodying what you're writing because you're open to experiences. So what inspired you to write this book, David?
So by the way, I have to pause. So it's simultaneously encouraging and disheartening to know that you underlined something in the book, because I love that. That means that you took something which as an author is awesome. But I'm also like a book nerd. Like I collect really well designed books and all that sort of stuff. And so I never write in books. I literally photocopy pages and then write on the photocopies because I want to protect the book. So I'm encouraged and disheartened at the same time. But oh well, we'll go with that. So. This was a bit weird for me. I like creativity a lot of times. It was not a linear path. I didn't sort of wake up and say I'm going to write a book about creativity and innovation. I set it out actually to write a leadership book. When I was in my doctoral program, I started out trying to do my doctoral project on leaders of creative organizations, of innovative companies. What did they do differently than presumably everybody else? And what I found was it got really challenging to find differences. Right? So, for example, it's really easy to look at an already successful creative company and show them as having all sorts of amazing people and incredible resources and all those things. But if you look at when they started out versus when a presumably non-creative company started out, there weren't very many differences. So you start to go, okay, well, what if the raw material when both parties of organizations started, what's different? And then I started noticing in my qualitative interviews, people were using different language. The people from creative companies were using different stories to talk about their processes, what they were doing, how they were doing it, how they interact on teams, than the people who weren't. And even on an individual level, just talking with friends about the idea, I started noticing that people who say they weren't creative would talk about creativity differently than people who would say they were. And this is where I get this idea of the myths, right? Because the bottom line, and I open a lot of speeches with this, the bottom line is that the stories that we tell ourselves are true even if they're not true, right? There's a thing called confirmation bias in psychology, which is basically a giant fancy way of saying exactly that. Whatever story you tell yourself, you deliberately or subconsciously sometimes look for information, facts, and sometimes screen away facts that disrupt your point of view, your worldview. So over time, the stories you tell yourself become true even if they're not true. So that kind of made me pivot. It's kind of funny. I talk about creativity and innovation and entrepreneurship, and it's all about the pivot, right? And so I had to pivot the idea. Maybe it's not about a leadership book. Maybe it's not actions leaders can take. Maybe it's about those stories. Maybe it's about correcting the stories that presumably non-creative people, non-creative companies are telling themselves. And so you get into all of these different stories that turns into this myths idea. There's in the ancient Greek tradition, there were all of these myths about muses. And you had 9 different divine sisters that were each responsible for different areas and for delivering that sort of creative insight. And I don't know, I used to say I don't know anyone that still believes in the muses. I gave a speech 2 weeks ago and someone came up to me afterwards in the hallway and told me that they still believe in the muses. So I know of one person out of nearly 8 billion people on the planet that still believes in the muses. We don't say that anymore, we don't overtly believe that, but we still use terminology to describe it. So we still talk about feeling inspired, which actually derives from the term breathed upon. We still talk about, oh, the idea just came to me, like it was somewhere else, and then it came over to where you were instead of coming from inside of you, right? And we still even, we go to see incredible creative works at a museum, and I don't think I need to sort of break apart that word and show you the origins to show you how steeped in this muse tradition we sort of still are. We still write myths and still write stories that try and explain the creative experience that are sort of half true, but now we don't really need to. We've had 50 years of psychological research and decades of brain research that look into what's going on when the creative mind and creative teams are performing. We don't really need these stories anymore. So the book is really an attempt to rewrite those stories, and hopefully that has an effect on shifting not just the already creative companies, but actually getting the everyday companies more creative as well.
Wow, what an intro. I am speechless. Yeah. I feel like jumpy right now. Elena, over to you for this.
Yeah, I'm a communications champion, and I look at everything through a communications lens, and the power of narrative and dialogue sounds like it's kind of interwoven into your concepts and of what creativity means. And so now I'm totally going off script, but I think the question fits very well, is as leaders, what types of narratives are we telling ourselves and others to unleash that creativity? What is it that the modern leader today, for example, at, I don't know, give me a company, Zappos is saying to unleash that creativity for their people?
Well, so, I actually don't know all that much about the specifics of Zappos. One of the best ones that I've leaned on in the book a lot, and actually, I love them from an HR perspective and talk about them in the HRM class that I teach. I don't know that they made it into the book. I'd have to look in the index of my own book to see if they did or not. But one of the companies I rely on a lot for my own sort of inspiration and the people with the leaders is Pixar and Ed Catmull. And by the way, so you need $35 to get free shipping for a book on Amazon, right? So grab this and also grab Creativity King by Ed Catmull. Buy them together and you'll get to that price point, right? I hope. If not, then his book decreased in price, which is a shame. It means it's selling more than mine, but oh well. Ed tells this story all the time. It's really embedded in the Pixar culture, which is that every Pixar film starts out terrible, and it goes through this process of going from suck to non-suck, right? Which is, I love the terminology, suck to non-suck. But the other thing that happens is in doing that, it presents this idea that yes, we're all capable of generating great ideas. But when we generate them, they don't come out as these fully formed, amazing pieces, right? We don't get into like some weird transcendental state and suddenly out comes a 50,000-word novel. It doesn't happen that way. You start out with an idea that's half good, half terrible, and you go through a process that refines it. And I think that's really the biggest thing, is realizing that coming up with creative ideas, number one, is everyone's responsibility, right? And everyone in an organization, the organizations need everyone's great ideas. So leaders need to tell that story. But the other is the realization that the first time someone's telling you their creative idea, it's probably going to be terrible. And you need to simultaneously acknowledge that it's terrible and acknowledge that it has the potential to turn into a great idea. So often, I think people in leadership roles, because you're wanting to minimize risks, if the idea sounds a little iffy, we nix it and we kill it way too early. And history is filled with great ideas that were rejected at first because they were a little iffy, but then turned out to be groundbreaking innovations.
And I totally agree with you. And I actually shot a clip for my YouTube channel a couple months ago that looked at how to unleash creativity in new employees, new generations. And, you know, maximizing and minimizing that risk, of course, is a natural priority in business. But it's about being open and mindful and encouraging people to come to the table with ideas. And through exchange and dialogue, I think those ideas can surface. So I totally agree with your point.
Totally. I mean, organizations need creativity from every department except accounting. And actually, accountants can be creative too.
So I think you're. I mean, so right now my head is on fire. To start with, you guys are just amazing.
We're only 12 minutes in.
I know. I mean, frick. I don't know if it's the. Are you near C or what? Or it's, I think it's just we need we need to do a brain scan of you right now, because this is amazing. No. I really want to pick up momentum here because, like you say, we're just 12 minutes in and already we're at high speeds, which is quite an open space experiment right now. But to me, you know, here's the experiment. So you, as an inspired creative leader, has written a unique book. Yes, I totally admit I have written, you know, I have, sorry, I'm. This is love. This is a labor of love.
I totally understand, and I love that. I'm just a total book nerd. I'm a total book nerd, and so I'm just the 1/2% that gets crazy retentive about keeping books perfect. So no, I totally get it, and I appreciate it.
And I think right there, I think we totally appreciate and love your love of books. And so yeah, that's a unique experience and experiment of having a book in our hands. So now that we have you with us live, I feel compelled to ask you the following question, which is, you know, whenever we read something, there's a direct audience. You are influencing people directly, people that will write in your book. So how do you want leaders to view creativity? And I totally get the stories here that you're, you know, speaking from, that creativity is a lifelong journey. It is a story that's unique. In every organization, there's a fertile ground. There's an openness to experiences. But how do you want leaders out there listening to us that want to know, you know, what's the creativity code, if there is a code? We have David Burkus with us, so how should we view creativity? How should leaders view creativity from your perspective?
So the organizational psychologist in me is sort of wincing, right? Because if you ask 10 researchers to give you a definition of creativity, you will get 11 different definitions and about 30 pages of footnotes, right? So it's a very nuanced thing. Everybody I've ever asked seems to have consensus around two words: novel and useful, right? So creative ideas are new or original or novel or useful, and at the same time they're useful, valuable, important, right? Novel and useful. So you have to have both of those qualities. It's not enough just to be new, right? Coffee shops are full of people who have a bunch of new ideas that the world doesn't really find all that useful, right? They're called baristas. And they're there, and they're waiting until the world to find them useful. By the way, no offense to anyone who's working as a barista right now.
Time to have a water.
That's what we tend to sort of say is the creative set, the creative brief, right? But if we use this definition of novel and useful, every department, every person is necessary for coming up with novel and useful ideas, right? Every department, every function of an organization runs into problems and needs to solve those problems, and thereby needs some creative thinking ability. The biggest thing that I think we've done wrong in recent decades or so is we've attached this term creative to certain departments and not to others. Mm-hmm. You know, and we even give out awards for creative achievement, which is code for advertising and marketing, right? And that's great, and we need creative ideas in advertising and marketing, but we also need creative ideas in operations. We need creative ideas in HR, right? The world has changed so quickly that we need some novel, some new, and some useful ideas about how to manage people, right? We need all of that. And so I think the biggest thing I would want leaders to do is see it as it's not just visual arts, it's not just music, it's not just advertising and marketing. Those are important, and those are usually areas that are fertile with creativity. That's why we call them sort of the creative industries. But at the same time, coming up with creative thinking skills and coming up with new and useful ideas is something leaders need to encourage everybody to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's my answer. There's so many gold nuggets here. I mean, it would be a disservice for me to focus on one, but I will just pick up on the one concept, which is HR. To me, the HR domain is totally undergoing transformation, and you know, I'm saying hello to Ted Coyne right there, the human side of business. To me, there's a whole renaissance of the industry going on. We're, you know, creativity is not something that is, you know, a specialty of one particular department. I think you're emphasizing that point very well. Mm-hmm. We all have creativity within us. It's not a personality trait. I think those are important messages. Elena?
No,
yeah, I'm sitting here and I'm nodding my head because everything, David, you're saying is, and that's what I find I do on these hangouts. I'm nodding because everything that is being shared is so profound with me. And so, you know, I totally agree with you. And if we limit ourselves to thinking about certain groups within organizations to be creative and others not, I think we're doing each other a disservice. And I think we're not encouraging others to keep growing and innovating in our creative thinking. So I agree with you, and Johan, I also agree with you as well, where HR is undergoing a transformation, and it's all about that new and valuable idea. And I think that's what strengthens and legitimizes certain functions of organizations, especially HR, so critical. But I just want to jump in. David, you mentioned something, and it goes back to our questions that Johan had prepared, and Johan, I'd like to ask it. What drives creativity? In some moments, we're creative, and others we may lose that momentum. How do we get back to that ideal state?
Mm-hmm. So I have two answers to that question, if that's okay. So the first is, I think so many people identify with this sort of flash of insight moment, right? If you ask most people where do they get their creative ideas, they will tell you in the shower, right? It's about the only time it's safe to discuss the shower at work, right? Is to tell people that you get all of your creative ideas in the shower. And that's interesting. It harkens back to Archimedes in the bathtub, right, or Newton and the apple, and we tell these stories about sort of flashes of insight. And so I think number one, the interesting thing is that we tend to tell ourselves a story that creativity is only happening in that moment, right? Yeah. When in reality, creativity is a larger process. That moment is important, right? And that moment can feel like that, or that moment can sort of be forced, right? So you can be working on an idea and then take a little bit of a break, what in psych terms is called the incubation period, and out of that incubation can come the flash of insight. Or what most often happens with me, out of that incubation period comes nothing, and then you get back to work, and then when you actually get back into engaged in the process, because you took that incubation period, you have more and better ideas. But sometimes we can have that Archimedes in the bathtub moment, that incubation takes it. But what I think is most interesting is that we love talking about those moments and we don't talk about the larger process. And that's sort of the second thing to this, is realizing that at any given time, if you're working on a creative idea, if you're working on any idea, you are at some point in the process. And if we want to get better and want to have more of these sort of eureka moments, then we need to do a better job of understanding where we are in the process. And so many different researchers have their sort of models of creative insight, right? It runs everything from 3 stages to 8 stages. I will save you going through each one, but they're there. And actually, I need to actually get permission to reprint this and put it on my site. Keith Sawyer did a great job of mapping out all of the different academic, totally boring nerd stuff. But the processes essentially look like this. You have to prepare. You have to do some amount of research on your idea, and then you should take a period of incubation, which can be taking a break entirely, going to the beach like I'm doing this week, or it can be just switching to a different task. Right? The research supports the idea of even just 5 minutes of switching from working on a really hard problem to doing something totally boring like checking your email. When you come back, you have more and better creative ideas. but you're still not done yet. There's still a process of testing the ideas, refining them, sharing them with the world, getting the world's feedback, and continuing to iterate until you have an idea, like we were talking about earlier with Ed Catmull, until you have an idea that starts out suck and goes to non-suck. So the biggest thing I think we can do to have more creative insights, have more flashes of insight, is realize actually that there's a larger process that we need to be deliberate about. So often I think we just rely on the flashes of insight to just sort of happen, to come to us, right? If we tell the story of Newton and the apple, for example, the moral of the story, which by the way is totally not a true story, I tried to find it but can't. But if we tell that story, the lesson of that story is sit under an apple tree and wait for a piece of fruit to peg you in the head. I don't know that anybody of us has to. You can't just tell your boss, I'm leaving for a day, I'm going to go sit under an apple tree and see what I find. But we need to understand the larger process, and we need to develop a process that works with us, and then always know where we are in the process, right? Sales, for example, is great at this. Sales always knows where a customer is in the sales process. The rest of us need to know where we are in the creative process.
I mean, okay. First of all, I am going to quote you tomorrow morning in the office about going from suck to non-suck. But what I'm interested in is between the gap between the suck and the non-suck. What happens in between? Don't answer yet.
Okay.
But I want to pick your brains on your journey just in the last 8 months here, from Microsoft to Google. You're on a pretty inspired path, my friend. So you going to Microsoft in December, you're going to Google recently. I mean, what happened during those moments? What views of creativity? So what I want to pick your brain on is you came into both of these enterprises with our flagship in the industry, and how different, what kind of engagement, what kind of discussions, stimulating discussions happen, and what view of creativity that people were left with, and what process of change occurred during those moments for you?
So I have to be really careful what I say here because we're on the Google Plus platform and it might just cut us off. Yeah. I found something really interesting. So the book launched in October, and we've been running all over the place, doing what we can to promote it since then. And one of the cool things is that both Microsoft and Google have this sort of authors at Microsoft, authors at Google series. And so I got an invitation from each to come and talk. And they actually, like, somebody stole this model from somewhere because they're almost carbon copies of each other, right? Everything from how they announce them to how much time you have to how they handle book sales, everything is a carbon copy of itself. The only thing that changes is the people. And here's what I think is really interesting. And of course, this might be totally different after the recent 18,000 person layoff announcement for Microsoft. Yeah. But I actually was shocked because if you compared the two, I felt like Microsoft had a little bit more sort of thirst for knowledge than Google did, right? So they were, in Microsoft, almost everyone, because it's never about the talk that you give. You know, that talk is sort of the same. I'm preaching the message of creativity, innovation, retelling these stories until I'm blue in the face, right, to different audiences. And so it's the audience reaction that changes. And really, it's the conversation that happens after the Q&A, right? I've been teaching at a university long enough to know that when you ask the audience, does anybody have any more questions, and they say no, it means half the room still has questions. They just want to talk about it afterwards, not during this set, right?
Interesting.
And at Microsoft, I was there for time discussing with people, interacting with people, as much as they could confidentially sort of share, right? And at Google, it sort of surprised me. And I don't know if I was off, but it was really kind of the same message. But at Google, most of the people sort of, about half the room just sort of disappeared right after the talk. And so I kind of ascertained that there are basically, like, and granted, this is a limited snapshot in, and please, Google, don't kick us off in the middle of this. But I felt like there's two camps at a company like Google. There's a camp that realizes, that sort of thinks like, we've got this down, we're the best in the business, and we're killing it right now, so we don't need to listen to anybody. And there's another camp that's sort of like, oh, this first camp doesn't get it. If we aren't hungry to sort of cannibalize our own great ideas, somebody else will, right? And of course, that second camp was the one that stood and kept hanging out with me and talking with me afterwards, et cetera. But I thought it was really interesting because I sensed this sort of undercurrent, right? Whereas at Microsoft, I don't know if Microsoft has just been so disappointed from getting their butt kicked by Apple for nearly a decade that they turned them into being thirsty and hungry for new ideas. But I really I picked up on that they did. Whereas Google, maybe not so much. About half the people did, about half the people didn't, which I think is really interesting. Now, that said, my talks were a really limited snapshot, and actually, I think having both camps may be a little bit better from an innovation standpoint, because you have people who are hungry, but you also have people who are focused on just small-time iteration and making what already exists a little bit better. I don't really know. It was an interesting take for sure. Very, very, very interesting take. And what I thought was really sort of interesting as well is literally just it's the right way to put this. So I made two gaffes in both presentations. At Microsoft, I talked incessantly about how much the company Evernote was amazing, and I didn't realize that half the room was designing the Microsoft OneNote program, right? So that was a direct competitor to Evernote, so oops, that was a big oops on my part. and in the Google set, I operated under this assumption that because Google is sort of among the HR set, Google is sort of famous for the sort of 20% time, but there was a recent announcement that they ditched it. And what I really learned to be true, I sort of assumed that it was there at one point, but it wasn't there. What I learned that was really funny is it didn't necessarily go away. It just was a reiteration of what they sort of always had as the unofficial policy, which is, sure, you can have 20% time, but only if you can get all of your work done, right? So it's really more, they made the joke that it's really called 120% time. And so my gap was basically in assuming they did away with it, when in reality what they did was realize their people didn't have the time to take it, so why be sort of promising that we have it, et cetera. Let's actually get more clear about the idea. So I thought that was interesting. The most importantly, though, both companies had vastly different cultures, right? We think about Google, we think about free food, free everything, which Microsoft kind of has. We think about all these fun, creative environments, right? Whereas in Microsoft, we might be tempted to think it's just sort of a cubicle farm. The reality is, though, that architecture alone is not enough to inspire a creative environment. It comes down to the people, right? Architecture is important, but ultimately it comes down to the people you have and the social environment that they create. And so what I thought was really interesting is the dichotomy between the two talks really sort of resonated to me, that it's not enough just to have really cool, fun, vibrant colors and foosball tables and all that sort of stuff. You need to be really serious about who you're bringing into the organization, but also how hungry they are. And I can see we're still on the air, so Google is probably okay with me saying all this.
We're hungry. We're quite hungry for what you're saying, David. Yeah. Elena, I will leave you to the last question in terms of practical tips, and then we can just be in the moment and be thankful for this. Elena, over to you.
And it sounds, well, before I wrap it up with the last question, it sounds like creativity is the essence of, a good corporate culture. And so I think that would be one of the first tips that you would give, or even I would give, is to foster a stronger creative environment, is to just invest in the culture. And so, what's today? Wednesday evening, it's almost 7:30. What can leaders do tomorrow morning when they get up and go to work to do more, to drive that creativity? What are the tangible tips that you can give to our viewers?
So easiest and most tangible, and it applies whether you're a senior leader, middle manager, or even if it's just yourself. What can you do tomorrow to be more creative? Right. And that is, and I'll have to decode this, but that is going from being I-shaped to T-shaped. So in the book, I talk about expertise and how too much of expertise can be a bad thing. And I think in leadership, when we run into problems, we seek out help just from dedicated experts in the area we feel like we have a problem in. In reality, the best insights come from people who are T-shaped, right? Who have a vertical expertise. They have a deep knowledge in some domain, but they also have a broad horizontal. And most education systems, most corporate training systems, all of that are designed to make people more I-shaped. But what we need are people who are more T-shaped. So starting tomorrow, try and build out that broader horizontal. Start hanging out with people in different departments. Start asking questions of stuff you don't understand, even if it's not your job. Even if all you do is go to a bookstore and go to the sections that are not where you normally buy books and just get stuff off the shelves and start reading it. Anything you can do to build out your broad horizontal will help you generate more and better ideas. And as a leader, if you encourage all of your people to be more T-shaped, will help you build that sort of culture of a broad horizontal where, and there's after effects to all of this, because if you have a broader horizontal, you can help other people in other departments more, which is even better for culture, all of that sort of stuff. So biggest piece of advice, be T-shaped.
Wow, David, it's not tea time, we're not in England, but I'm drinking water to you as a virtual champagne. I'm really, really pleased and great. And I mean, my brain is on fire from this 30-minute. This is going to be a hangout that I know I'm going to go back and back and back in time again. And before we launch into the hangout, Elena suggested a post. Well, I think there's going to be a few written on this one. And I'm really pleased that we're finishing on such a powerful note. Really feel that leaders out there listening to us are going to feel like, whoa, I've never heard this before, but breadth and depth of experience nurtures creativity, and we each have a role to play in this. So this has been a Rockstar Speaker Series, first with our friend David Burkus, the author of The Myths of Creativity. If you haven't seen this, check it out. As David suggested, if you go on Amazon and go and check Ed Catmull, you might get some free shipping with the 2 books. So, well, David, it's been a pleasure.
Yes. I can do you one better. If you're still deciding what that second book could be, if you go to my site, davidburkus.com, and click on the resources tab, there's a bunch of resources about the book. There's long-form keynotes I've given about the book, all of the sort of ideas. The ideas need to get out there, and so those are free. So if you go to that page, there's a ton of different resources that you can download, share, do whatever you want with, as you figure out what the other books to put in your shopping cart are. There
we go. So, Elena, quick goodbye to everybody.
David, thank you so much for being here this evening, and goodbye, everyone. Great seeing all of you.
Thank you all so much. This was so much fun.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Elena. On behalf of the HR Rockstars tribe, until next time, cheers.